I've sold the house. The papers are ready for you to sign. Amelia. So stop looking. So useless. That was the nuclear bomb Victor dropped. Delivered with a smug, self-congratulatory grin in front of 300 of Chicago's top climate investors. This was his latest grand gesture, a man deep in debt, obsessed with appearances, who was sacrificing my most sentimental possession, my childhood home, to save his floundering company. Ether Dynamics. He called it a courageous sacrifice he was making, demanding that the financial burden, to be grateful for his genius. He expected me to collapse, to panic, to silently comply and nod, while tears welled up in my eyes, proving once again that I was nothing without him. My hands did not shake. I just offered him a cool, slow smile that unnerved him more than any panic ever could. What he did not know was that this brazen act, this violation of my sanctuary, it was a fatal miscalculation. It was the final trigger for his complete and total ruin. If you want to see how a woman who was called a financial burden orchestrates her husband's complete bankruptcy with a single signature, hit that like button and subscribe. I'm just getting started. They called me a lowly housewife with a useless master's degree in environmental science, but in reality I was Ms. Black, the anonymous CEO of Lumos Corp., the Luxembourg-based holding firm that was the primary source of all Ether Dynamics emergency funding. Victor had no idea that the wife he dismissed with contempt, was the secret angel investor who had pumped nearly $50 million into his renewable energy pipe dream for the last 3 years. It was pure desperation on his part that led him to announce the sale of our house at the Ether Dynamics annual gala, a desperate attempt to show the room full of potential investors that he was taking decisive steps to address his minor debt crisis. He stood on stage under the harsh spotlights and delivered the fatal blow. He made a show of patting my hand as he mentioned the sacrifice the useless wife was making for the sake of his genius. I still remember the feeling of that moment, a cold, specific type of loneliness that only comes when the person you swore your life to treats your sacrifice as an annoying transaction. I had endured his arrogance for 5 years while secretly funneling my family's inherited fortune through Lumos Corp. To keep his payroll running, a fact he completely ignored. Victor was busy buying himself a $20,000 Rolex to wear for the gala, while I was silently transferring $3 million to his accounts, just to keep Ether Dynamics from defaulting on its bond payments. The irony was deafening. He had laughed at me just last week when I suggested he hire a proper compliance officer. He said I should stick to picking out dinner recipes because I clearly did not understand how the big boys played the game. He dismissed my expertise, because he could not bear the idea that his wife could be smarter than him. That contempt, that casual, crushing dismissal of my entire professional worth, that was the only currency he ever paid me. I could still hear his booming voice echoing in the grand ballroom, a symphony of self-importance as he tried to sell the sale of my house as a strategic masterpiece. Amelia's little pet project has been put on hold, he said, smiling at me with those cold eyes. We are selling the house to give Aether the liquidity it needs. She understands this is for the greater good. I watched the pity in the eyes of the other wives and the calculating assessment in the eyes of the investors. They saw a desperate man and his meek played-in, soon-to-be penniless wife. They expected me to nod, to accept the humiliation of losing my home, to be the broken woman he always believed I was. But Victor's arrogance had blinded him to the single, massive trap I had meticulously set months ago. When I funneled the first $10 million to his company through Lumos Corp., I made sure the loan agreement was ironclad, a masterwork of corporate jurisprudence. Hidden deep within the financing documents was a clawback clause, a tiny, innocuous-looking paragraph that stated Lumos Corp., the anonymous lender, could instantly freeze or recall the funds if Ether Dynamics CEO Victor liquidated any critical personal assets without prior written consent from the lender's designated representative. The clawback clause defined our family home as a critical personal asset because it was secretly co-signed by one of my shell companies. Victor was on stage declaring his victory, believing he had secured his next wave of financing by making this public announcement, but he had not checked the fine print. He never did. He always assumed I would handle the tedious, boring details. As his voice swelled with pride, I calmly took out my secondary burner phone, the one with the secure Lumos Corp line. I did not text, I did not call. I simply uploaded the exact terms of the Clawback Clause to a secure channel linked directly to the Luxembourg legal team. The action was irreversible. The moment the terms were met, the trigger was pulled. Suddenly, Victor's presentation was interrupted not by me but by his frantic CFO, a sweating man named Mark, who rushed onto the stage, waving his phone like a madman. Mark whispered something urgently into Victor's ear, something that made the color drain from his face, and the victory smile vanish instantly. The funding it's pended, the wire transfer is frozen. Mark hissed loud enough for the microphone to catch the last word, a single, sharp word that echoed the silence of the room. Victor, the man who had just announced his triumph, was suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, his grand announcement destroyed by a contractual anomaly he didn't even know existed. The investors began to whisper. The confidence was gone just like that. Victor, his face tight with pure, narcissistic rage, quickly tried to cover his mistake by throwing me under the bus. He grabbed the microphone and glared at me, the meek wife standing silently near the side exit. It's a clerical error. A simple paperwork issue from Amelia's side, I'm sure. He spat the words out like venom, his eyes promising swift and cruel retaliation. I will fix this myself. I will handle the sale personally and expedite the funding by tomorrow morning. I am the CEO, and I will get this done. He vowed to expedite the sale himself to force the funding through, but all he was doing was digging his hole deeper and making his next mistake more public and more destructive. He had underestimated the wife who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Victor's fury was a thing of predictable beauty, a temper tantrum wrapped in a designer suit. The moment the wire transfer froze, he stopped acting like a CEO and started acting like the spoiled child he truly was. The next morning he stormed into the house, dragging two expensive, aggressive buyers in tow, a man and a woman named the Harrisons, who specialized in quick cash sales. They wanted to bypass the normal legal process and sign immediately. He was hell-bent on finishing the sale himself, believing that if he just got the paperwork done, the money would have no choice but to follow. He tossed a pen and a stack of papers onto the kitchen counter, the exact spot where I had spent years quietly paying his invoices and covering his gambling debts. Sign here, Amelia. They are offering full price. Cash. Closing in 48 hours, he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. This is necessary to save the company, you understand. You do not get to be emotional about a property that is technically mine. He fully expected me to sign immediately. His company was on the verge of missing payroll. His reputation was sinking. And he knew I was terrified of public bankruptcy, so he believed he had me cornered. The look in his eyes promised ruin if I dared to hesitate, a public financial humiliation that would prove I was the worthless wife he always claimed I was. The Harrisons, this aggressive buyer couple, stood behind him, smirking, already discussing which walls they would tear down first to install their gaudy new kitchen island. They saw me as the final, easily subdued obstacle in their way. But I had anticipated this desperate move 2 years prior, a quiet, calculated act of foresight he never noticed. While he was busy entertaining his mistress in Miami and telling me I was too rustic for their upper-class life, I had been quietly filing paperwork to protect the last piece of my sentimental life. I had the house declared a historic landmark, a status that severely restricts external modifications and delays any sale by 90 days. A restriction he never bothered to check because he thought the property belonged to him alone. That landmark designation, that useless piece of paper he would have mocked me for creating, was the leverage he was about to attack. He handed me the pen, his hand still shaking with narcissistic rage. Now, Amelia, sign it. Stop being difficult. I calmly picked up the pen, but instead of signing the deed, I used it to point toward the front door. At that exact second, the doorbell rang, an unnervingly calm sound in the tense air. Victor exploded. Ignore it, he screamed. But the Harrisons were already looking toward the door. A middle-aged man in a tweed blazer and thick glasses walked in. He was a land surveyor named Mr. Blainett. Wallace, whom I had retained weeks ago, an ally I had scheduled to arrive at the peak of the tension. Mr. Wallace did not panic. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked past Victor and approached the counter where the documents lay. He looked directly at the Harrisons, who immediately stopped discussing kitchen islands. "I apologize for the interruption, Mr." Wallace said, his voice completely level. "But I must inform the prospective buyers that this property, effective immediately, has an officially filed historic landmark designation certificate on record." He placed the laminated certificate right on top of Victor's unsigned deed, a final physical declaration. "Any external structural changes, which I believe you were planning, are now subject to a rigorous 90-day review period by the City Council. Furthermore, the sale itself is subject to this 90-day cooling-off period to ensure compliance." Victor's mouth fell open. He looked at the certificate, then at me, then back at the Harrisons, who were instantly furious. The aggressive buyers were not interested in 90 days of bureaucratic hell. They were interested in a quick cash flip. 90 days. "This is a joke," the woman snapped at Victor. The man threw his hands up in disgust. "You wasted our time, Victor. You are an amateur, and this property is a nightmare." They snatched their briefcases and stormed out of the house, calling Victor every name in the book. My sentimental object was safe, and Victor's desperate attempt to secure quick capital had failed spectacularly. Victor was left standing alone at the counter, staring at the landmark certificate. The humiliation of being called an amateur by his own buyers was total. He slammed his fist onto the countertop and turned his rage toward me, his face twisted with pure hatred. "You did this, you worthless, conniving little mouse," he snarled, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is your doing. You will pay for this. You will pay for everything." He had been publicly humiliated in his financial endeavor, but he was about to learn that attacking my house was only the start. Now he was going to attack my past, my history, and my only public accolade, my environmental research award. He had no idea that the award was the key to his company's entire profitability. Victor was obsessed with the idea of a clean slate he needed to scrub away the taint of his previous failures, and he believed my quiet accomplishments were the biggest stains. His next attack was designed to destroy the one thing I had ever achieved publicly, the Ether Dynamics Innovation Award I had won years ago, for my environmental modeling research, a distinction he always dismissed as my useless little pet project. He called a press conference the following afternoon not to discuss the failed sale, but to announce a major corporate restructuring that involved shifting away from what he called unprofitable, old-school environmental models. He stood at the podium in front of a dozen reporters and a live video feed for investors and launched his cruel, targeted attack. Ether Dynamics is moving past its previous, frankly, unscientific fluff, he announced with an arrogant wave of his hand. "We are retiring old programs and awards that were more about public relations than actual efficiency." The camera zoomed in on the placeholder graphic on the screen, a small, black and white image of the very award I had won. He didn't even use my name. He just called it fluff, proving once again his total contempt for my intelligence. He expected me to be mortified, to call him crying and beg him not to ruin my one public accolade. He expected me to finally break. He believed by destroying my environmental research, he was erasing my last claim to relevance, my last bit of identity. What he did not know was that the core algorithm that predicted the efficiency of Ether's most profitable turbine sites was the very heart of that unscientific fluff registered under my maiden name years ago, a fact he overlooked when he took over the company. That algorithm was the leverage, and he was about to publicly denounce the source of all his wealth. While he was busy telling the world that my work was worthless PR, I was using the secure Lumos Corp line to send a single, concise message to a trusted contact in the press pool. The message contained one sentence: "Ask Victor if the unscientific fluff algorithm is the only reason his most profitable turbine sites are currently operational." Victor had just finished explaining how his new, costly strategy was going to replace the old ways when the moderator read out the question that came from an anonymous source. The microphone crackled as the moderator delivered the payload. "Mr. Thorne, an anonymous question has come in asking if Ether Dynamics is aware that the unscientific fluff algorithm is the only reason their current turbine sites are profitable." The room went silent. The silence was palpable. Victor froze, his perfect CEO smile shattered instantly. The question was too specific, too precise. It hit him right where it hurt. He tried to laugh it off a harsh, dry sound. That is a ridiculous question. A cheap shot from a rival, I assume. He looked terrified suddenly, realizing the precision of the attack. But the investors watching the live feed were not reassured. The reporters instantly started whispering and tapping furiously on their phones. They knew something Victor didn't. They knew that questions that precise about a company's operational efficiency usually came from an insider. The press conference dissolved into a chaotic mess of questions about profitability and operational secrets. Victor was trapped on the stage, screaming into the mic that the question was slander, but his panic revealed the truth to his entire investor base. He looked like a desperate man cornered. The public humiliation was total. He had just trashed his own golden goose on live television, and he had no one to blame but the anonymous sender. He left the podium in a blind rage, convinced this anonymous attack came from a rival fund, the Summit Group. He had no idea he was fighting his own wife. His anger was now focused not just on me but on the rival CEO he was certain was orchestrating his ruin. He was about to launch a targeted character assassination that would bring in the most powerful man in the city, a man I knew very well. Victor's mind worked on simple, narcissistic principles if something bad happened. It must be the fault of a rival who was jealous of his genius. He convinced himself that the Summit Group Ether's main competitor was responsible for the anonymous question that humiliated him. He decided to launch a direct, public character assassination against their newly appointed CEO, Elijah Thorne. This was his reactive escalation, a rival CEO slander trap designed to smear Elijah's reputation and buy Victor some much-needed market time. He spent the whole night crafting an anonymous, defamatory blog post, a poison pen letter disguised as an industry analysis. The post accused Elijah Thorne of having zero executive experience and claimed he had failed to lead a single profitable venture in the last decade. Victor hit send, believing he was deploying a tactical nuclear strike against his enemy. He expected the Summit Group to scramble to deny the slander, to issue a lengthy press release to waste their precious time defending a lie. He expected them to panic, just like he always expected me to panic. What he didn't know was that I had been secretly communicating with Elijah Thorne for months. Elijah wasn't just a rival CEO. He was a former colleague, a true genius in the renewable sector, and a man who understood Victor's style of predatory business better than anyone. He was my new, powerful ally, a strategic partner I had quietly cultivated. Victor's attack was not just against a competitor. It was against a man I had personally vouched for and a man who was about to defend me. The blog post went live at 9 o'clock that morning. It was nasty, brutal, and totally baseless. Victor sat in his office, refreshing the newsfeed every 2 seconds, waiting for the inevitable public relations firestorm from the Summit Group. He was practically vibrating with victory, believing he had finally gotten the upper hand. But the firestorm never came. At 10 o'clock, the Summit Group's official corporate Twitter account posted a single, concise reply, a devastating counterpunch. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't a press release. It was just 4 words and a signature. A public declaration of war. Check your own balance sheet. Victor. E.T. The internet exploded. The public and the media immediately recognized E.T.'s confident, aggressive style. A man who clearly didn't waste time arguing with a cornered rat. The lack of denial, the simple, devastating dismissal. The absolute confidence in those 4 words, it destroyed Victor's slander instantly. The irony was total. Victor had publicly attacked a powerful man, believing he was defending his own reputation, but the attack only revealed his own desperation and incompetence. That simple reply, the most expensive tweet Victor had ever received, caused Ether Dynamics stock to immediately dip 3% on the implied threat of a massive legal countersuit. The slander trap had backfired horribly, making him look even more desperate and juvenile than before. Victor was shaking in his office, realizing that the Summit Group was far more ruthless and far more informed than he had ever suspected. He looked at the stock ticker. The 3% dip was the final nail in the coffin. He realized he needed capital immediately. He needed to find a way to silence the phantom enemy that was coordinating these relentless attacks. He concluded that his only move was to publicly cut me off completely, to use the drama of a public divorce to leverage sympathy and attract emergency investment from some poor, unsuspecting fool. He was about to declare war on the one person who had kept him afloat for 5 years. He was about to make his final, most public mistake. Victor needed a performance, a grand display of tragedy and sacrifice to pry open the wallets of the elite. The Chicago Climate Charity Gala was the perfect stage. It was packed with the exact kind of high-net-worth individuals he was desperate to lure. He planned to use the drama of a public divorce to paint himself as the noble, struggling CEO betrayed by a useless wife, a victim seeking a fresh start. I knew he was coming for me. I had moved all critical personal assets out of his reach months ago, anticipating this financial cutoff. The only thing I had left in his name was the apartment building downtown, which he didn't know I had already quietly transferred the deed to my Luxembourg holding company. I had prepared my complete financial separation. The financial leverage was secured and waiting. Victor took the stage to present an award, his voice dripping with forced emotion. He launched into his final, vicious attack, the public divorce demand. It is with a heavy heart that I announce tonight that Amelia and I will be parting ways, he declared, his eyes sweeping the crowd for sympathy. Sometimes a man has to make the painful choice to cut off the dead weight to secure the future of his dreams and his company. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence hang heavy. He portrayed me as a financial sinkhole, an unfortunate burden he was finally casting aside. He fully expected the room to pity him and to see me as the newly broke, utterly defeated woman destined for obscurity. The crowd of 600 people gasped. The whispering was instant, a tidal wave of social judgment. Victor smiled internally. He thought he had won the narrative. But at that exact moment, the gala host, a respected society figure, returned to the microphone holding a white envelope. The host looked stunned, almost reverent. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just received a truly remarkable contribution. The largest anonymous donation of the evening. An unprecedented $50 million from a new, exceptionally generous benefactor. Victor froze mid-step, his mouth slightly open. $50 million. That was enough to save Ether Dynamics twice over. He looked around wildly, trying to find the source of the donation. The host, still looking awestruck, continued with the twist. The donation was made in the name of Lena Morgan, who we are thrilled to announce has also agreed to step in as the new Perdios. Anonymous gala chair effective immediately. Lena Morgan. My maiden name. The name I had quietly used to incorporate my primary holding companies. The sheer volume of the donation, $50 million, instantly obliterated Victor's entire narrative. He had just declared his wife a financial burden, a sinkhole he needed to cut off, only to have her under an alias publicly donate an astronomical sum, making him look crueler and pathetically broke in comparison. The crowd wasn't pitying him. They were looking at him with utter contempt. They realized he was divorcing a woman who was clearly on a different financial stratosphere than him. The payoff was total social inversion. Victor stood there, paralyzed, his hand still stretched out in a gesture of false martyrdom. He realized that the woman he called a financial sinkhole was actually a financial ocean. The air crackled with his shame, a humiliation far greater than any stock dip. His fury was immediate and focused. He knew I had orchestrated this. He knew I was Lena Morgan. He couldn't attack my money. He couldn't attack my house. He couldn't attack my ally. His next logical move was to attack the very system that protected me, the law. He needed to silence me legally. He needed to shut down the source of the ridicule. He was going to sue me for slander and defamation related to all the anonymous attacks he had suffered. He was going to drag me into court. Victor had lost the narrative. He had lost the house, and he had lost the goodwill of his investors. Now he was seeking the ultimate revenge, the one place he thought I was truly vulnerable, the courtroom. He filed a malicious lawsuit demanding a public apology and $5 million in damages, claiming my anonymous actions had caused Ether Dynamics to lose a key venture capital deal. This was his attack, the lawsuit and the false testimony, designed to bleed me dry with legal fees and silence me forever. He expected me to settle out of court. He expected me to panic at the sight of the official court summons because I was just a housewife with no business experience. He fully believed I would fear the public exposure of a high-profile case, a fear he had spent years cultivating. He saw the lawsuit as the final weapon that would prove I was the parasite he had always claimed. What he didn't know was that while he was busy ignoring his company's mounting debt, I had been subtly cultivating an internal ally inside Ether Dynamics. Mark, his timid personal assistant, was tired of Victor's erratic threats and abusive behavior. Victor had, with unbelievable stupidity, used Mark's company email to document his most volatile internal rants and illegal instructions for handling the Clawback Clause situation. This internal documentation of his crimes was my leverage waiting to be deployed. In court, Victor's lawyer presented a fabricated timeline claiming my malicious intent began immediately after the gala. The lawyer droned on about lost profits and my unreasonable refusal to sign the house deed, a classic victim performance. Victor sat there rigid and arrogant, expecting a swift victory, a public shaming that would confirm his victim status. Me lover, a quiet but respected litigation specialist, waited for Victor's side to finish their dramatic opening statement. When it was our turn, my lawyer didn't launch a dramatic counterattack. He simply introduced a time-stamped piece of evidence. It was an email chain from Victor to Mark, the timid personal assistant. The chain, which Victor had forgotten existed, proved with brutal clarity that Victor was planning to sell the house and use the proceeds for a personal luxury investment, not for Ether Dynamics, weeks before the Clawback Clause was triggered. Victor was the one who had violated the contract first. The lawsuit was not a reaction to my slander, but a cover-up for his own malicious intent. The sheer hypocrisy of Victor's claim hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. The judge, a woman known for her zero tolerance for frivolous lawsuits, immediately looked down at Victor, who was now white as a sheet. "Counselor," the judge stated, her voice ice cold. "The plaintiff's own evidence shows his claim is based on a timeline that is willfully misleading. The malicious intent here appears to reside with the plaintiff, not the defendant." The judge didn't even allow the lawyer to argue. She immediately dismissed the slander charge as without merit and granted me a small, immediate judgment to cover the legal fees for this ridiculous motion. The payoff was instant justice. Victor was publicly exposed as a liar in a legal setting and forced to pay my lawyer. Victor's face crumpled. He was not only denied his public vindication, but was also made to look financially weaker because he had to immediately cut a check. He knew I had won the legal skirmish, but he was blind to the method. He was convinced that Mark, his timid personal assistant, had intentionally collaborated with me. He was sure I had paid Mark off, and he was right to suspect treachery. His rage was no longer about the money. It was about control and the betrayal of his inner circle. He vowed to find out who my real power was, the CEO, the one who was truly pulling the strings. Victor was now convinced I had a powerful, wealthy lover funding my defense, and that this lover was secretly the CEO of Lumos Corp. His paranoia was my leverage. I had already anticipated this desperate move. Instead of paying a legitimate private investigator, he tasked his two most incompetent employees, his brothers, Brad and Chase, with performing deep surveillance on me. They were tasked with proving I was a cheating gold digger violating my prenuptial agreement. I was aware of the black SUV and the terrible camouflage the moment they started following me. I had long since established the decoy meeting a deliberate misdirection designed to consume Victor's time and resources. I arranged to meet with an incredibly handsome, completely harmless man named Julian, who was my yoga instructor at a remote coffee shop. Julian was a former client of my family's foundation and was happy to play the role of the secretive romantic entanglement. This was my false lead trap, a perfect execution of the test intelligence type. Brad and Chase, feeling like secret agents, filmed the entire meeting. They captured images of Julian holding my hand as he helped me stretch after a complicated pose photos of whispered conversations over coffee and what they thought were passionate goodbyes. They rushed back to Victor, convinced they had caught me red-handed, proving I had violated the prenup and was cheating on him. Victor was triumphant. He barged into the house, slamming the surveillance photos onto the table, his eyes blazing with self-righteous fury. I knew it. "Amelia, you, pathetic fraud, You're cheating on me with this gigolo. You're meeting him in secret to secure your financial freedom. He expected me to panic, to cry, to beg him not to use the photos in court or to admit to the affair. He expected me to confirm his deepest-held belief that I was a deceitful, sexually motivated parasite who had betrayed him. But I remained perfectly still, my back straight, my expression unreadable. I waited for him to finish his entire arrogant rant, his victory lap. When he finally ran out of breath, I casually picked up the photos and examined them. I looked up and spoke one simple, devastating sentence. That's Julian, my new fiduciary. The twist was immediate. I explained, in a calm, flat voice, that after the generous donation I made at the gala, the foundation required me to appoint a personal fiduciary to manage the $50 million endowment. Julian was a certified financial planner, and his hand-holding was simply a demonstration of a new carpal tunnel exercise. He manages the money, Victor. Not me. I stated clearly. I introduced him to my lawyer last week. He is now responsible for ensuring I meet all my financial obligations, including the legal fees you were just ordered to pay. The payoff was total, immediate ridicule. Victor's triumph dissolved into sputtering incoherence. His brothers, Brad and Chase, who had been waiting outside for their praise, were now laughing uncontrollably. They hadn't caught a gold digger, they had chased a yoga instructor. Victor was publicly mocked by his own incompetent allies for wasting time on a harmless yoga guru instead of finding a real CEO. Victor was humiliated. He had spent the last of his meager cash hiring the wrong people to chase the wrong target. He realized Ether Dynamics was now on life support. He knew he had to stop playing games and use his last lifeline, a massive, highly risky bank loan that would force him to put up everything as collateral. He needed capital, and he needed it now. Victor was financially drowning his company, hemorrhaging cash, and his credibility destroyed by a series of spectacular public failures. He knew one more missed payroll meant the end. This led to his most reckless gamble, yet the collateral gambit, a high-stakes last-minute bank loan. He was forced to put up all remaining personal and company assets, including Ether's intellectual property as collateral. He secured the $10 million lifeline at an outrageous interest rate, and with incredibly punitive covenants. He threw a celebratory party that evening, a desperate, sad attempt to project confidence to his rapidly diminishing circle of friends and employees. He walked around the room puffing out his chest, boasting about his genius turnaround, claiming he had secured Ether's future despite the market's irrational panic. He expected this victory lap to rally his staff and convince the few remaining investors that he was the visionary savior they desperately needed. What he didn't know was that I knew the fine print of that loan better than he did. I knew the specific covenants of the bank loan because Lumos Corp, my holding company, was the hidden primary creditor to that very bank, a fact that gave me complete internal visibility and control. My secret financial control was the leverage he was boasting against. Victor's loan application, which he personally signed, contained a massive and fatal flaw. It grossly understated Ether's actual debt by omitting the initial $40 million in loans from Lumos Corp that I had secretly funneled to him over the years. This was a clear violation of the loan's core covenant requiring full disclosure of all outstanding liabilities. While Victor was busy toasting his supposed victory, I was calmly making a few secure clicks on my computer. I sent an anonymous, concise report directly to the bank's internal compliance officer. The report didn't accuse Victor of fraud. It simply presented the two conflicting balance sheets, the one Victor signed, and the true one showing the Lumos Corp loans. The twist came when the bank's head of compliance, a stern woman named Miss Davies, walked into Victor's party. She didn't cause a scene. She walked directly up to Victor, who was mid-sentence describing his brilliant negotiation skills. She handed him a single sheet of paper, a formal notice. Mr. Thorne, due to a material misrepresentation on your loan covenant, all funds are immediately frozen, and a fraud investigation has been initiated. She announced loud enough for every remaining guest to hear. The bank is calling the loan and seizing the collateral pending review. The silence that followed was heavy, complete, Victor's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor, a perfectly poetic sound. The celebratory party was ruined. His guests, realizing they were standing in a room with a man being investigated for fraud, immediately scattered. The bank freeze destroyed his credibility with his few remaining allies. The payoff was total. Instant humiliation, and the realization that his last financial safety net had been yanked away. Victor stood alone in the wreckage of his celebration, the $10 million gone, the collateral seized, and his company facing mass layoffs. He knew he was financially cornered. In his desperation, he would turn his rage away from the bank and toward the one thing he felt he still owned: the physical presence of his wife in his life. He decided to lock me out of the house and cancel my utilities. He needed to prove I was helpless without him. Victor was cornered, financially ruined, and facing a criminal investigation. He lashed out with the cruelty of a desperate man. He wanted to hurt me on a physical, tangible level. He decided to execute the utility cutoff and the eviction, a malicious act designed to make me homeless, cold, and begging for his return. He knew I still occasionally visited the old house to pick up things, and he wanted to prove that without his name and his money, I was utterly helpless. He changed the locks on the old house, sent an aggressive eviction notice via certified mail, and publicly boasted on a private investor forum about cutting off the water and electricity. He posted a photo of the darkened meter box and the changed lock, believing he had finally delivered a blow that would break my spirit. He expected me to be shivering in a hotel room, calling him hysterical, and begging him to reinstate the utilities. He believed the loss of basic comfort, the physical hardship of no water or heat, would finally prove my dependence on him, the worthless parasite he had always claimed I was. What he didn't realize was that I hadn't been living in that house for weeks. I had been staying in my new, luxurious, ultra-secure penthouse downtown, a fact he was entirely oblivious to. More importantly, I had protected the house itself. The historic landmark designation that I had filed in Part 2 was my leverage. Now I used it to protect my comfort. Deep within the city's utility statutes was a provision that prohibited the shutoff of power or water to any protected historical structure without 90 days prior written notice to the city council. Victor's rage had made him overlook the power of bureaucracy. When I received the certified eviction notice, I calmly forwarded it to my lawyer. My lawyer then immediately notified the city's utility commission, presenting the official landmark designation status as proof. The system Victor thought he could manipulate was about to turn on him. The twist was swift and humiliating. Not only did the utility companies refuse to acknowledge Victor's order, they immediately dispatched a crew to his house to investigate the unauthorized shutoff. Victor was at home celebrating his supposed victory when the utility crew arrived. They ignored his shouting and his demands to leave. They simply presented him with a massive emergency violation fine and proceeded to immediately reconnect the power and water, making sure the house was habitable again. The payoff was the immediate dismantling of his petty tyranny. He was not only forced to pay a massive fine, but the sight of the utility crew working on his property to serve me was a public embarrassment in his own neighborhood. Victor stood on the porch looking utterly defeated, forced to retreat from a house that was now powered and secure thanks to a law he never cared about. He was forced to realize that even in his physical space, he had zero control over me. His mind snapped. He realized he was fighting a professional phantom enemy who was always 5 steps ahead. He decided that the only way to stop the bleeding was to identify the source of the attack: Lumos Corp's anonymous CEO, Ms. Black. He was going to stop playing legal games and use brute force. He hired a team of high-level hackers to find the identity of the woman who was slowly killing him. Victor was no longer attacking me. He was attacking Ms. Black, the anonymous CEO of Lumos Corp, the phantom enemy that was coordinating his complete and systematic destruction. He hired a team of highly paid, aggressive hackers to breach Lumos Corp's high-security server and unmask her identity. He believed that if he could expose her, he could ruin her reputation and force her to drop the $40 million loan that was now strangling Ether Dynamics. This, too, I had anticipated. The hacker attack was merely the final stage of my corporate honeypot trap. I, as Ms. Black, had intentionally left a complex trail in a high-security server containing a false ID. The decoy identity was a high-profile, established tech titan named Vivian Vance, a name with immense social and financial weight, who was known to be intensely private. My leverage was the controlled information, the false identity that would backfire on him. Victor's hacker team worked for 48 hours straight, breaching firewalls and bypassing protocols. They finally found what they believed was the jackpot, the verified identity of Miss Scrata, Black Vivian Vance. The tech titan. Victor was ecstatic. He was sure he had won. He planned to publicly announce that Ms. Bach and Ingzadel, Black was a fraud, a corporate spy who had been illegally manipulating Ether's stock for months. He expected the market to turn on her and for her career to be destroyed. But at the exact moment Victor was preparing his public announcement, I was holding my own small, private press conference. While his hackers were celebrating their win, I was delivering the twist. I announced that the esteemed tech titan Vivian Vance was now suing Ether Dynamics and Victor Thorne personally for corporate espionage and illegal hacking into her private data. I presented forged but convincing evidence that Victor's team had been caught trying to steal proprietary information from Vance's systems. The payoff was instantaneous and devastating. Victor's hacker team, still logged into the Lumos server, was immediately arrested by the FBI at the moment they thought they were heroes. The FBI, alerted by my pre-prepared complaint, had been tracking their IP addresses the entire time. Victor was publicly named as the funder of the illegal operation. His desperate attempt to expose the CEO only resulted in him being charged with a serious federal crime, corporate espionage. Victor was facing imminent arrest and total financial collapse. His collateral was seized, his bank loan was frozen, and now he was a wanted felon. In his final, desperate and irrational act, he realized his only remaining asset was the intellectual property rights to the core algorithm, the one I secretly created. He decided to liquidate the IP to fund his legal defense and escape. He had to sell the core of Ether Dynamics. Victor was now a desperate, wanted man. His company was a shell, and his only remaining asset was the core algorithm, the intellectual property I had created and registered under my maiden name years ago. He was driven by pure, animalistic survival. He needed cash to flee the country and pay off his legal defense. He scheduled a hasty, highly secretive meeting with the CEO of a rival firm named Quantum Energy to sign over the IP rights. This was his final patent, divided by IP sale attempt, his last chance at financial redemption. He was oblivious to the fact that I held the original patent itself, and that Ether Dynamics only possessed a licensing agreement, a distinction he had never bothered to understand. The license agreement he held was worthless without the underlying patent, which was tucked securely in my offshore vault. My original patent ownership was the leverage he was about to sell his future against. Victor met the CEO of Quantum Energy in a private room at a downtown hotel. He tried to project confidence, boasting that he was selling the brains of Ether Dynamics, the very technology that ensured their efficiency. He bragged about how he would finally be free from his useless wife's constant interference. He called the whole ordeal a learning experience that had taught him to rely only on himself. He expected the Quantum CEO to sign the deal, immediately securing him the $2 million he needed to disappear. But as the contracts were laid out, and Victor reached for the pen, the room door opened, not with security but with a powerful, confident man flanked by two lawyers. It was Elijah Thorne, the CEO of the Summit Group, my powerful ally. The twist was immediate and total. Elijah Thorne wasn't there to sign a deal. He was there to announce a hostile takeover. I apologize for the interruption. Victor. Elijah said, his voice cool and authoritative. But the Summit Group has just completed a hostile acquisition of Quantum Energy. I am now your new boss. Or rather, your new competitor. Victor looked like he had been punched. The CEO he had been negotiating with stood up, looked at Victor with contempt, and then immediately looked to Elijah Thorne for instruction. The Quantum CEO was now an employee of the Summit Group, and therefore an extension of my ally's will. The payoff was instant destruction of his final asset. Elijah Thorne walked over to the table and casually picked up the contract Victor was about to sign. He didn't read it, he simply tore it in half, then dropped the pieces onto the table. This is worthless. Victor. Elijah stated clearly, The intellectual property you claim to own is currently subject to multiple fraud claims and patent infringement disputes. Furthermore, we don't buy broken companies. We buy them." He gestured toward the former Quantum CEO. Victor was left with nothing. No buyer. No cash. And no IP. Victor was defeated. He had sold his soul for nothing. He stared at Elijah Thorne, the powerful man who had orchestrated the entire market attack. His mind was fixated on one thing, Miss Pieces. Black. He saw the new CEO of Lumos Corp., the powerful woman he couldn't name, as the source of all his misery. In a final act of desperation, he decided to crash the Lumos Corp annual shareholder meeting and publicly expose Ms. Corp annual shareholder meeting. Black as a fraud. Victor was completely unhinged. He had lost the power struggle. He had lost his money, and he was consumed by the need for one final act of vengeance. He decided to attack the phantom enemy directly by crashing the highly exclusive Lumos Corp annual shareholder meeting. He believed that if he could expose Miss Black as a fraud, he could somehow negate all the legal and financial damage she had inflicted. This was his attack the shareholder meeting crash. He managed to sneak into the high-security New York venue using a fake press badge. He was trembling with desperation and wild-eyed conviction. He watched the board chairman begin the formal proceedings, and he waited for his moment. When the chairman announced a brief technical break, Victor saw his chance. He leapt onto the stage, seizing the microphone and screaming at the bewildered investors. "Ms. Black is a cowardly fraud, a corporate manipulator who has ruined my life." He shrieked, his voice echoing off the expensive marble walls. "She hides behind lawyers and shell companies because she is a criminal. I demand to know who she really is. Show us her face. She has destroyed Ether Dynamics for her own sick pleasure." He expected the Lumos board and the shareholders to panic, to demand the CEO's identity be revealed to confirm his narrative that Miss Cayman's Black was a shadowy, illegitimate figure. He expected chaos, and a complete disruption that would buy him time. The shareholders, however, did not panic. They looked at Victor with detached disdain, a spoiled child having a meltdown. The board chairman, a calm, elderly man, simply called for order. He then introduced the executive vice president of Lumos Corp., who would be addressing Victor's outrageous claims. This was the twist, the final public confirmation of my legitimacy. A man walked onto the stage, a man who moved with quiet confidence and undeniable power. It was Elijah Thorne. Elijah Thorne didn't address Victor. He addressed the shareholders. He looked directly at Victor, who was now frozen on stage mouth agape, and then back at the room. "The board wishes to state for the record that Mr. Thorne's claims are entirely baseless," Elijah said, his voice ringing with authority. He then added the ultimate, specific jab, "and our anonymous CEO, Ms. Black, is not present because she is currently dealing with a minor pest control issue at Ether Dynamics." The room erupted in restrained laughter. Elijah Thorne's statement was the payoff of public, absolute humiliation. Victor's desperate plea for justice was reduced to a joke, a pest control issue that was beneath the CEO's notice. Victor was dragged away by Lumos security guards, utterly defeated and stripped of all dignity, but still unaware of the phantom enemy's true identity. His mind was broken. He had lost everything, and his only thought was that Amelia, his useless wife, was the only remaining source of salvation. His father called him in jail and demanded one final move. Victor must publicly confess his love for me and beg me to forgive him. He was going to use sentimentality to execute the one thing he thought I would never reject, a false plea for reconciliation. Victor was following his father's desperate advice, his final, manipulative attempt to regain control. He believed that despite all the years of abuse and betrayal, I still harbored enough residual affection to save him from his spectacular downfall. He was going to use the public plea for forgiveness, a staged display of tears and regret, to appeal to my supposed weakness, my soft heart. I knew this was his last-ditch effort, the final emotional weapon he had left. I had endured his entire history of psychological abuse, his gaslighting and his contempt for 5 years, and I knew this performance would be his most vile. I had already prepared for this moment. My leverage was his own truth, a pre-recorded video confession from his mistress confirming his true financial motives for the divorce. a weapon that would destroy his pathetic display of love. Victor staged the plea outside the old house that he had tried to evict me from. He brought a bouquet of cheap roses and even managed to attract a few local media vans and a small crowd of onlookers. He stood there, weeping dramatically, proclaiming his undying love and how he couldn't live without me. Amelia, my love. I was foolish. I made terrible mistakes, please. My darling. Take me back and save me. I need you, he cried out. The performance was utterly nauseating. He expected me to be swayed by his performance and the public sympathy to rush to his side and forgive him, proving I was the pathetic, emotional fool he always thought. But I arrived in a black sedan, not alone but standing next to Elijah Thorne. I walked toward Victor with a calm, deliberate pace, my expression utterly unreadable. I wasn't wearing my usual plain clothes. I was dressed in a sharp, ice blue suit that screamed power and detachment. Victor's face lit up with false hope as I approached, but before he could touch me, Elijah Thorne, my ally, stepped forward. The twist was brutal. Elijah didn't speak. He simply held up a small, portable video screen. The screen immediately began playing a video of Victor's mistress not crying but calmly speaking into the camera. She detailed Victor's true motive for seeking the divorce, his financial desperation, and his plan to use the divorce settlement to pay for her extravagant apartment. She specifically mentioned that Victor had mocked me for being a worthless parasite even as he sought the divorce. The public confession of his hypocrisy and greed was a complete revelation. The cameras immediately focused on Victor, who was now reeling in shock and horror. The payoff was total social destruction. The media and the crowd immediately turned on him, realizing his love was a calculated, manipulative performance. He was exposed as a heartless, mercenary liar right in front of the cameras. Victor was completely broken. He stared at me, the woman who had just used his lover to confess his crimes. He finally realized the depth of the betrayal. He had nothing left, no money, no allies, no reputation. His only remaining thought was irrational vengeance. He needed to physically destroy the one thing I held dear, the old house. He decided to break into the house, believing I had hidden something valuable there to destroy her peace once and for all. Victor was past logic, past reason, past survival. He was consumed by the need for pure, irrational revenge, the final act of a broken man. He believed that the old house, my childhood home, I must contain some hidden document or stash of cash that was the key to my power. He decided to execute the final trespass and the arrest, a violent, desperate attempt to destroy my peace and find the evidence he craved. He drove to the house in the dead of night, a shadow of his former self. He didn't use a key, he simply shattered a large window with a rock and climbed through the jagged opening. This was his attack, a physical, destructive act against the one sentimental object I had fought so hard to protect. He stumbled through the darkened rooms, tearing apart furniture and smashing objects in a blind rage, looking for a secret safe, a hidden ledger, anything that would give him the upper hand. He expected to cause massive emotional damage and financial chaos, believing he would get away with it since the house was technically empty and he was the former owner. What he didn't know was that I had anticipated his emotional collapse. I knew his predictable need for violence and destruction when he was cornered. I had installed a high-tech silent alarm system linked directly to the Chicago Police Department the moment he changed the locks. That pre-prepared security system was my leverage designed for this exact moment of irrational trespass. As Victor stood in the middle of the living room wreckage, panting and defeated because he found absolutely nothing, the twist happened. The beam of high-powered flashlights sliced through the darkness and the house was suddenly filled with the clear, authoritative voices of the Chicago Police Department. The officers burst in guns, drawn immediately, taking control of the scene. Victor was too stunned to resist. He stood there covered in dust and glass, utterly broken. The payoff was instant, and Total Victor was immediately arrested for breaking and entering and vandalism. The officer placing the handcuffs on him didn't mince words. "You are under arrest, Victor Thorne. Furthermore, this property is not yours." The officer stated clearly, "It is owned by a shell corporation, which has pressed charges. You have absolutely no right to be here." Victor was taken to jail, no longer the arrogant CEO but a common criminal. The officers confirmed his identity, and the final catastrophic domino fell. The police realized he was the wanted subject of the FBI fraud investigation stemming from the hacking incident in Part 10. The charges were immediately upgraded to include federal warrants. Victor was facing prison. Not just bankruptcy. The stage was set for the final court confrontation where I would finally reveal my true self. The courthouse was packed with reporters and onlookers, the air thick with anticipation. Victor was sitting at the defense table, no longer the arrogant CEO but a broken, defeated man wearing a cheap suit and flanked by a public defender. He was facing charges ranging from corporate espionage to fraud and vandalism. He was at the absolute bottom. This was the final stage, the moment of total inversion, and I was ready to claim my victory. I was dressed impeccably in a bespoke black suit, my hair pulled back, my eyes radiating cold confidence. I was no longer the meek, vulnerable housewife. I was the power he had fought so desperately to avoid. Victor, in his final disparity act, still clung to his narrative of innocence. He arrogantly attempted to represent himself, arguing that his ex-wife was a worthless nobody and that he, the true visionary, was the victim of a corporate smear campaign orchestrated by Ms. Black of Lumos Corp. He looked directly at me with contempt during his rambling speech, believing he could still wound me with his cruelty. He expected sympathy from the jury, and a reduced sentence, believing his charm would work one last time. The prosecutor, however, cut him short. She called the final witness the anonymous CEO of Lumos Corp., the woman Victor had spent months trying to unmask. The air in the courtroom tightened. The tension was palpable. I calmly walked to the witness stand, not as Amelia Thorne, the scorned wife, but as the architect of his destruction. I was the twist, the final, complete realization of his fatal mistake. I looked directly at Victor, who suddenly went white as a ghost, recognizing the cold, detached power in my eyes. Please state your name and position for the court, the prosecutor requested. I leaned into the microphone, my voice clear and steady, echoing through the silent room. My name is Amelia Thorne, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Lumos Corporation. The revelation was immediate and catastrophic. Victor instantly collapsed, physically slumping in his chair, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. He finally realized the entire plot. The worthless housewife he had scorned, the financial sinkhole he had dismissed, was the powerful, anonymous entity that had systematically stripped him of everything. The prosecutor then presented the final piece of evidence, a detailed chart illustrating the Lumos Corp loans. I explained to the court that the $40 million was my family's money, secretly used to save his failing company, and that his greed and contempt for me triggered the Clawback Clause the moment he tried to sell my house. He wasn't ruined by a rival. He was ruined by his own arrogance and his fatal misjudgment of my worth. The payoff was total poetic justice. Victor was found guilty on all major counts and escorted out of the courtroom, facing years in federal prison and total financial ruin. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright sunlight, not alone but standing next to Elijah Thorne, now my fiancé, my equal. The reporters shouted questions, but their voices faded behind us. I looked back one final time and saw Victor's public defender escorting him to a waiting transport van. He looked at me, his eyes filled with absolute, genuine regret, the knowledge that he had lost everything, because he had underestimated the woman he thought was a worthless parasite. I didn't feel broken. I didn't feel shaken. I just felt free. I had found myself and I had ascended. He had regressed to nothing.